7 verses.
That
I'm
works.
just kidding. Let's just do 1 and 4.
Just the right one across the
I have a song I love to sing since I have been redeemed of my Redeemer, Savior, King, since I have been redeemed. Since I have been redeemed, since I have been redeemed, I will glory in His name. Since I have been redeemed, I will glory in my Savior's name. I have a home prepared for me, since I have been redeemed, where I shall dwell eternally, since I have been redeemed. Since I have been redeemed, since I have been redeemed, I will glory in His name. Since I have been redeemed, I will glory in my Savior's name.
Thanks for singing another one. Give my brain a chance to shift gears just a little bit here. Got a message just a little bit ago. Jim Shields is home from the hospital. However, he's still having some bathroom issues. So keep praying for him that his intestines will jump themselves into operating order. Is that a kind way to say that? What was that?
Let's just get them moving.
Just get them moving. Well, I could have said that, I suppose. All right. Well, we are in Esther chapter 9 and 10. And we've got a lot of ground to cover. Some of it will feel a little bit reviewish, and we'll do that. But as we get started, I thought I would kind of share with you. We've been talking about laws and things, and sometimes how laws get enforced, and sometimes they don't get enforced. But I thought I'd give you a few interesting ones. In Alabama, it's against the law to dress like a member of the clergy or a nun. You can get fined $500 for doing so, including holidays like Halloween. In Alaska, you can't operate motorcycles or power tools at night. I'm just telling you. In Arizona, it's a law that you cannot interfere with a claw machine. So those games, those crane claw machines, if you interfere with those, it's a misdemeanor crime. Don't honk your horn after 9 o'clock in Arkansas. Just telling you, it's there, it's on the books. California, you can't eat frogs that have died in a jump frog competition. So if you were in a leapfrog competition, that frog's off the menu. Otherwise, you can eat it. Frog legs aren't bad, y'all. In Colorado, it's against the law to use upholstered furniture outside. Connecticut, this should probably, never mind. Connecticut, you can't sell silly string to a minor. It's in the same category as selling alcohol and tobacco products. That's not necessarily a bad idea, but I can think of a few people that are over minor status that shouldn't have it sold to them too. In Delaware, you can't whisper or use profane language in a place of worship or within 300 feet of the place of worship. That wouldn't be so bad. Florida, don't feed the alligators. In Georgia, it's against the law to have chickens crossing the road. It actually says chickens, ducks, and geese or any domestic fowl to run across the road, streets, or alleys in the cityway. So the joke's out. There's no why did the chicken cross the road, because if he did, he's in jail. Why you can't post a billboard unless it's on your property? That wouldn't necessarily be a bad rule. If you have a piece of, you can't, it's like you can't advertise somebody else's business on your property. It has to be just yours. In Idaho, you can't carry a red and white cane unless you're completely blind. In Illinois, it's illegal to dye a baby chicken, like color dye them. Anybody else remember when they dyed the ducks and chickens? Well, not in Illinois, you don't. In Indiana, it's illegal to catch a fish with your bare hands. Some of y'all can't catch them with a pole, so bare hands are not worried about it.
That would never fly.
In Iowa, you may not pass off fake butter as real butter. So you can't sell imitation butter under the name butter at all. So you have to call it oleomargarine. The fact is, at one point, you had to color it a different color. It couldn't even be the same color. So you could have pink butter, for example. Kansas, if you're over the age of 14, you can't play on a playground. Kentucky, you're not allowed to use reptiles in religious services. They don't abide by that one. West Virginia needs that law too. In Louisiana, you can't have a reptile at Mardi Gras. Maine, you can't gamble in the airport. I don't know how to do this one. In Maryland, you're not allowed to release stench bombs, whether bodily function or privately manufactured, that produce an offensive odor. I guess you're not allowed to do that in public around a cop. I don't know. In Massachusetts, let's see, whoever sings or plays the Star-Spangled Banner on an instrument in any other place other than the whole composition could be fined, so you can't do part of it. You're not allowed to be drunk on a train in Michigan. In Minnesota, you can't be charged or convicted with the offense or public drunkenness on civil property. So get drunk at your house, but not by the courthouse. Is kind of there. Mississippi, I wish they'd bring this one back. Don't use profanity. If you swear in public, you can be fined $100. That cleans some up pretty quick, wouldn't it? Unenforceable. Missouri, you're not allowed to sell cars on Sunday. Montana, you can't have your animals on the railroad track. Don't ask me. Nebraska, you're not allowed to get married if you have an STD. Remember when you used to have blood work done to get your marriage license and stuff? That's all out the window now. Lottery laws in Nevada. New Hampshire, it's illegal to collect seaweed. So in New Mexico, you can't dance while wearing a sombrero.
But they do.
It's illegal. It says it right here. I got the statute number and everything.
Part of the dance.
Prior to COVID-19, it was illegal to wear a face mask in public places in the state of New York. In North Carolina, you cannot steal or sell waste grease. So you can't take somebody's grease off the restaurant and put it in your vehicle or your tractor or whatever. You can't refine those oils and all of that. There's laws. You can't be arrested on Sundays or on the 4th of July in the state of Ohio. Yeah, that one's not enforced. Oklahoma, tattoos were banned until a partial resection of the law in 2006. But it didn't tell me how it was changed. It said it was partially changed. In Oregon, if you leave your car door open for an extended period of time, you can be guilty of a misdemeanor. Pennsylvania, you're not allowed to set off guns or explosives at weddings. Just saying. In Rhode Island, you can't steal poultry or receive stolen poultry. I don't know. Now, South Carolina's was really kind of interesting. Males over the age of 16 cannot seduce someone under the promise of marriage. So you can't say, I'll marry you. It's illegal to do so, to get sexual favors. In South Dakota, you're not allowed to use fireworks to protect your sunflower crops. It says fireworks, not firearms. That's what I thought was interesting. In Tennessee, you cannot import or possess a skunk. Unless he's your husband. No. Man, there's so many of these crazy laws that were out there. I thought they'd be a little bit fun. All right, here's the world ones. It's illegal for a cab in the city of London to carry a dog or a corpse. You laugh, but I personally know somebody who transported a corpse from the state of Texas to the state of Michigan in their back seat. It happens. I'm not going to tell you the whole story, but I know it did. It's illegal to die in the House of Parliament. I don't know. Some of y'all be in trouble if this was the law here. It's illegal to place a postage stamp upside down of a monarch. I get postage stamps upside down all the time. In France, it's forbidden to name your pig Napoleon. Just saying. This one was kind of interesting. In Alabama, it's illegal for a driver to be blindfolded while driving a vehicle. No duh. No duh. Another Ohio law. This makes sense because I'm from there. It just makes sense because this is about all laws. It's illegal in the state of Ohio to get a fish drunk. I don't know if you got the goldfish at the county fair and you brought him home and put him in beer. Is that what happens? I don't know how you get a fish drunk. But do you all know how to do that? Please, no, don't tell me. I don't want to know. If you pull into the port of London, you have to give the constable of the Tower of London a barrel. You got to share. In the UK, a pregnant woman can legally relieve herself anywhere she wants, even if she so requests in a policeman's helmet. Okay. It's illegal to skateboard in a police station in Florida. I'm not going to tell you that one. That one's bad. In England, all men over the age of 14 must carry out 2 hours of longbow practice a day. I don't think that's being enforced anymore either.
That's from the Middle Ages. Yeah.
In San Salvador, drunk drivers can be punished with the death penalty, including the fire squad. That probably solves a few problems too. In Florida, unmarried women who parachute on Sundays can be jailed.
Married women are fine.
I'm just telling you, this is what it is. In Kentucky, it's illegal to carry a concealed weapon that's more than 6 feet long. That had to be written back, when muskets were going on. I mean, I've got some rifles, but none of them are 6 feet long. If you're a Welshman, you can't be in England before sunrise or after sunset. In New York City, it's illegal to murder a Scotsman within the city walls, but only if he's carrying a bow and arrow. There's all kinds of these crazy laws. We understand that laws are necessary to maintain a certain amount of protocol, a certain amount of rule of law, but then you get in a society like Persia, where literally laws were created on a whim. And even though the edict of the king or the things that the king signs and puts his seal on cannot be revoked, it's interesting to me. We didn't talk about this much, but nobody's balking at the Queen's new law. Nobody's saying, well, we don't do things like that. You can't make a law to do away with the law. You can't work around that. Nobody's saying that this is not possible. So the question that's begged is, did they do that in other situations where you could write a law that would somehow go around one of the laws that were already existing on the books? I don't know. Throughout the book of Esther, it's like every time there's an issue, there's a decree that comes about, whether it's marital defiance or the amount of wine that's to be served, or in the case of Haman's edict, the wholesale annihilation. Somewhere right around 1 million Jews were probably believed to be in that area, spread out throughout the region. So it's quite a large population, but it's spread out, so it would have seemed probably quite small. People gave way to imperial whim. These 7 advisors could come up with things, whatever you were upset about, you could create a law over. You know, it was just that kind of whimsical thing. And you say, well, they're not really that crazy. Well, I'm talking about Persia at large. Their history was filled with these kind of whimsical laws that based on whatever somebody thought of at the moment. And that's why you had these 2 edicts that kind of clashed together in the month of Adar on the 13th day, somewhere around March 7th on our calendar. Now it's interesting if we think about it, is that God has been pleased at different times in history to startle the heathen world by something like this. This is kind of pretty startling. This is kind of, without his name even being mentioned, he's chosen to commit himself to the Jewish people, and the rest of the world at this point has been left in darkness. The only way to get into light, the only way to get into salvation, if you will, during this time is to become a Jew. Outside of that, there was not a pathway for that. But there were often things that God used. You could think of the destruction of Pharaoh and his armies at the Red Sea. You could think of some of the things that happened with Nehemiah, some other big miracles. And this big drama that's going on in Susa is pretty amazing. Spurgeon said, it's been well said that the book of Esther is a record of wonders without a miracle. And that's a pretty good statement. There's nothing that's necessarily what we would qualify as outright miraculous, but crazy and wonder driven. Absolutely, that's definitely we've seen that. But we still see the glory of God. We are challenged to seek peace. In the Old Testament, they were challenged to seek peace until the Jews were. Jeremiah, God's counsel to the Jews through the prophet of Jeremiah was specifically that, to seek the peace of the city where I've caused you to be carried away captive. You've been carried away into captivity, seek peace in that area. And so we get into this, and if you will, the Jewish D-Day has arrived, the appointed day of Haman's decree for the slaughter of God's chosen people. But Mordecai's decree has, in essence, changed the destruction into a path of deliverance. The Jews have gotten permission to resist their enemies. They've been given about 9 months to prepare for the encounter. And people who were in the empire that hated Jews probably were still excited about the possibility. But then the possibility of the Jews having the ability to defend themselves probably scared a few people off. And then with the announcement that the king's wife, the queen, was Jewish, may have also further stayed. You don't want to tick the king off by killing his wife's family members. That's not a wise structure. So let me see how much we can remember here. How long of a time period does the book of Esther cover approximately?
10 years.
Roughly 10 years. The primary focus is in about a 13-month period. Okay, it's about the 13-month period from Haman's edict to what would become Mordecai's edict, and then the carrying out of that. And so we've got basically between chapter 8 and chapter 9, we have about 9 months of time periods that have passed. So Adar 13, roughly March 7th, probably 473 BC. Some people dated at 356. According to the Jewish calendar, it was 3,405 days since creation. Again, that's one of the things that I marvel at, when it comes to this creation, God creating the earth in 6 days. In the old earth theories, the Jews seem to have a way to have monitored this, and it's a relatively low number in comparison to what the world considers out there. So let's get into chapter 9, and we're going to break this down into sections. But I wanted to bring the map back up and kind of remind you of everything that's been going on regionally. And we'll do my best. I tried to do this. We'll see how it looks in here. And if it looks really bad, I'll just move on. But again, this is the whole Persian Empire. Everything in this purplish, brownish color is the whole Persian Empire. So, wrong one. Everything over here kind of tracing into Greece. Remember that Xerxes has a failed campaign to go in and capture on down into Greece. He has a failed campaign. Really, he did not expand the kingdom much at all. So you see this area. Let me see if this layout, is that the one I want? There it is. There's the one I wanted to lay over top. It's kind of blurry, but I wanted you to see where we're talking currently. So again, here's Greece. There's the area. Here's Egypt here. So we are concentrating. Everything that's happening is happening right in here. Syria, Iraq, Jordan. There's Israel. That's what we're looking at right now. There's Georgia, Turkey coming across. All these other Ikstans and Afghanistans and Turkmenistans and all that stuff. So when you see it, laid on top of each other a little bit, it kind of helps you visualize where we're talking about. This is without the overlay on it, what it's looking at, and this is with the overlay over top of it. So basically, the center of what we're looking at is right in this region right here, which is right in the middle of Iraq. So that's roughly the areas that we're talking about. The timeline of this is kind of interesting. I found this timeline. I thought I'd at least share it with you. This is put together by a Jewish scholar. So we're talking specifically under the reign of Ahasuerus. And it's too long for me, but I wanted you to see this 1 year countdown. This is what I really wanted you to see. So this is, we talked about Nisan and going over to Adar. This is the big countdown. Mordecai's counter decree came in about 9 months in. So Haman's decree was in existence for roughly about 3 months before Mordecai's decree comes into play. They got 9 months to basically make this all happen, so that what's going to happen right here. Specifically, of all that big time happened in those 2 days between Esther's banquets, what was meant to be a day of destruction became a day of deliverance. Now, looking at Persia on a little broader perspective, so from the Trans-Euphrates over here, Cyrus, Darius, Xerxes, Artaxerxes, okay? So you've got Zerubbabel, Ezra chapter 6, you've got Ezra in Ezra chapter 7, and you've got Artaxerxes in Nehemiah, but Esther's right in between there, right there next to Xerxes. What is going on? Esther and Ezra, there's some parallel things going on during the reign of all of these Achaemenides empires that have been going on. Man, there's stuff in there I didn't want in there. All right, let's look into chapter 9, beginning in verse 1. Now, in the 12th month, that is the month of Adar, on the 13th day, when the king's command and edict were about to be executed, on the day when the enemies of the Jews hoped to gain the mastery over them, it was turned to the contrary, so that the Jews themselves gained the mastery over those who hated them. The Jews assembled in their cities throughout all the provinces of King Ahasuerus to lay hands on those who sought their harm. And no one could stand before them, for the dread of them had fallen on all the people. Even all the princes of all the provinces, the satraps, the governors, those who were doing the king's business assisted the Jews, because of the dread of Mordecai had fallen upon them. Indeed, Mordecai was great in the king's house, and his fame had spread throughout all the provinces, for the man Mordecai became greater and greater. So we're going to break this down and looking at all the power that is going on. Again, we've had nine months that have lapsed between 8 and 9. The day that everybody's either dreading or excited about. It would depend on how much you liked or hated the Jews and how much you liked Haman or hated Haman. That would have been the categories that you would have. It had been a day of dread for the Jews. And to some degree, I mean, let's process just a minute. Even though you've been told that you're allowed to take up arms, there's still going to be some insecurity here. I mean, we're talking, a lot of people versus your small population. Maybe 10 times as much in some studies. So I think I try to process, the Jews are so excited about, being able to defend themselves, but some wives are not going to be too happy their husbands and their kids are going off to war, so to speak. You know what I mean? There's this idea. So it's still, as excited as they were to have the possibility to be delivered, there has to be also a little bit of dread of what might happen. Because it wasn't illegal for a Persian to kill a Jew during this time. Yep.
You mentioned that they may be going to war. You got to remember the type of people that we're talking about. These are just common folks. These are not warriors or soldiers.
Their army was totally defunct at this point.
Yes.
The Jewish army the Jewish people being in captivity had no army any longer.
Right.
Now they did, and they had at different times throughout their history, but not now. It stands as some commentators say that it stands as a symbol or a theme of everything that has happened to the Jews during the diaspora. Remember, what's the diaspora? It's a big word. We get thrown around sometimes in churches. But what's the diaspora? Does anybody know? What?
The dispersion.
The dispersion or the spreading out. They're all scooted out everywhere. The Jews are away from Jerusalem. So once they've been pushed out of Jerusalem, the diaspora, and they have not, that's why all you're hearing about all the stuff in the news right now about their land and all that stuff, the disputes and all of that, that's why we're talking about this, is because the Jewish people have been scattered for so many years until the Jewish state was reestablished. But that did not change the fact that God gave the land to them. It was their inheritance. It was their place. And that's what's so funny when you listen to some of the debates that are going on about what's going on in the Middle East currently. If you have an extreme Palestinian, not all Palestinian, the extreme Palestinian, you'll hear them talk about, they just want a two-state solution. Well, when they say, I forget how it says, from the what to the sea, from the river to the sea, thank you. Couldn't remember, from the river to the sea. That's not a two-state solution. That's the complete abolition of the Jewish state. From the river to the sea means there's no Jewish nation anymore. And that's what the argument is going on over. So it's kind of current in our brains, but that kind of theme of captivity, of struggle, of people trying to smush out the Jews and God providing a pathway. I've said it before, but it's worth repeating once again that God has always had a remnant of the people of Israel, and he always will until he restores her during tribulation and into the millennial kingdom. A lot has changed in the 9 months. All of a sudden, one commentator wrote in his notes, unlike Garth Brooks' song, the Jews did have friends in high places. I thought Garth Brooks' song was something about low places, but maybe that's somebody else's song, I got friends in low places. But now all of a sudden, the queen is a Jew. Now all of a sudden, the prime minister, the second in command, is also a Jew. So now there's at least a little bit of dread not wanting to harm these officials. Fact is, it appears that most of them wanted to do whatever they could to help. There are two laws operating in opposition to each other, and the officials could ultimately choose to follow either one and still be obedient to the king. They could do whichever and still do what the king had said was appropriate to do. What kind of tipped the balances, at least in these first 4 verses, is it starts out as a dread of a people, but then it gets down to the dread of a person. It says that they are concerned about the man Mordecai as he become greater and greater. The man has now become a substance of fear. They're afraid of what the consequences might be if they happen to go on. I mean, before, what's the consequences? If you know, there's not a lot of consequence if you didn't necessarily go along with Haman's edict. If you were nice to a Jew, I mean, there wasn't necessarily anything, but now there's consequence. The word is, well, by the time you get through this passage, you're going to see that the word was either follow Mordecai or become a shish kebab. It's pretty much what the options are at this point. It was, I guess, I can't remember who said this. It was faith in the written word of the king that gave the Jews joy and gladness, even though the formerly dreaded 13th of Adar had not yet come. So it is with you and I that faith in the written word of God should give us boldness and confidence, though the day of doom, once feared, has not yet arrived. It's faith in the substance of what has been executed. The writer of Esther then summarizes the outcomes of the day's event so that we will have no doubt what's happened. We've already heard some of this, and now I'm going to state it all in a chapter's kind of summary. And it's going to be, there's no doubt what all has happened, is happening, and what the future is supposed to look like. He gives the impression in these first 4 verses that most of the opposition has melted away. It appears that. I mean, if you look in verse, at the end of verse 2, verse 2, the Jews assembled in their cities throughout all the provinces of King Ahasuerus to lay hands on those who sought their harm, and no one could stand before them, for the dread of them had fallen on people. People were like, oh, wait a second here, we don't want to do this. So there's a change of mind. That does not mean that there was no uprising. We're going to see that as this chapter unfolds. It's a stress on fear that was inspired through this edict, through the Jewish people, and then by Mordecai himself, kind of implies of something other than human intervention. Now, I'm not going to go so far to write something in here that's not in here, but this widespread of a change does seem to imply something more divine going on here than just human intervention. Mara?
Well, I guess I won't say it, but when you read on, like you were saying something about there not being a miracle, but it was like a wonder. Wasn't there a miracle here? Because I haven't heard of any Jews getting killed. They only mentioned the other side.
Yeah, we don't get the record of that. We'll talk about that when we start talking about numbers. It's kind of like the impression spread that Mordecai is not going anywhere. He's second in line to the throne, and it's probably not a good idea to mess with him because he could, in theory, assume the throne without an heir, without a male heir coming off the line. He would have been the king. Now, in these passages, it double emphasizes the word day. It emphasizes these hints at the resolution all coming. It's this overturning, if you will. Fact is, the Hebrew word that is used to overturn, that's translated the English word overturn, is this idea of an emphatic thing. It is a complete turnaround. It's used elsewhere, like when sorrow is overturned with joy. It is when mourning has been turned into dancing. The verb conveys a change of circumstances that also involves a change of emotions, attitudes, a change of spirit. And so this verb, it is explaining not just the physical things that happen, but the overall atmosphere of what has happened. So the author begins to summarize all of this, and honestly, though deaths are mentioned, there is not really this bloodthirsty victory terms that would usually be used in this kind of story. I mean, yeah, there's some bloodthirsty issues. I mean, a guy hanging up on a gallows is not exactly non-graphic. I mean, we don't think it so much because we're used to so much other things. The Jews' power, again, is limited to exercise against those who hated them, who sought to overpower them. Talks about going into all the cities throughout the empire. That's why I wanted to put that map back up there. We're talking a huge area of uprising that has to be defended by a relatively small group of people in correlation to the ones that are the ruling powers throughout them. When it talks about this fear, it wasn't because of their numbers. It was a fear in something else. And it's not clarified in the text. Now, we can say it was because of the fear of their God. We could say it's the fear of what Mordecai had become. But there's a legitimate fear of perhaps the organization of the Jewish people, because they've not seen this before. They've not seen the organization of a group. The best thing they've seen is many uprisings where people would have sent a couple assassins to try to kill the king, which has already been thwarted. But they've not seen a group of people, at least not that we're aware of. Some commentator says that it reminds them of the experience of Jacob as he traveled from Shechem to Bethel back in Genesis 35. It said that the terror of God was upon the cities that are around them. They didn't want to go after the sons of Jacob. There was this legitimate fear that swept around the whole communities. Same fear that went before Israel as they entered the promised land in Deuteronomy. Rahab told Jewish spies that the fear of Israel had paralyzed the nations of Canaan. So this idea of national fear is not an unprecedented idea. It's just not laid out for us in the way we're used to hearing it textually.
You said before that there were no miracles that were shown.
Well,
This could just be a miracle, God putting the fear, like he confused the audience.
Yeah. I think, Spurgeon's separation of the idea of miracles and wonders is intriguing to me, and there's much more he had to say about the topic, which made me understand what he was going to say. I just couldn't really disperse all of that. But the idea is we don't see, God striking dead a whole group of people, and we see it written, the hand of God, smited Haman, or the hand of God smite. We don't see that kind of miracle. But I very much think that these wonders could be definitely categorized as miraculous, and I would include that potential fear of God. But there probably were some people, like Pharaoh was early on. Remember early on, who is this God that I should listen to him? I mean, that was Pharaoh's initial responses. So there's probably some other thing. The question that would get begged is, up to this point, have the Persian people seen the power of God at work in the nation of Israel in a way in their current history that would have caused them to experience these things? The answer in this 10-year period is no. Not really. They've morphed into culture. A few of them went back to Israel, but there's not this huge revival type situation where there's such a devotion to God and such a devotion to the Torah and the law of God that would have put fear into into the minds of the people. And you don't want people to be, I don't want people to be scared of God, but I really wish people would be afraid of him a little bit. There was a fear of God at one point, even in our own land. We called it that, we'd say things like, it's good to have a healthy fear of God. I mean, I don't want God to be viewed as sitting up there with a 6-shooter waiting on seeing who he can pick off. But at the same time, he is a holy and he's a righteous God that does execute judgment. And his long suffering does have a limit. There is a point where God says that's enough. And whenever God says it's enough, it's not usually a good thing. Not usually for any group of people. But it's kind of important for us to not lose that. So we see the Jews going from a hunted group of people to being a favored group of people. They were already most likely mistreated on some level as a captive people. They weren't necessarily favored. They could have been treated okay, but they're not going to have status as such. But now you've got this big turnover in power. It's an interesting point when we get to this point, when we start talking about what the Jews did. I think it's Swindoll said that someone has said the most dangerous human plunder being on earth is a prisoner who gets hold of a weapon. That's there's an interesting thing to think about. You have this captive people who've had no weapons in theory to now having weapons. They've had a mistreated group of people with no influence and no authority. Now they've got weapons. What are they going to do? What might happen? And it's a legitimate, I think, processing your way through it. When we think about the high list of officials that are listed out for us, and they're listed. Different translations use different words. They're officials, princes, captains, commanders, nobles. That's that first group. The second group are the satraps, the lieutenants. They were viewed as the guardians of the realm, according to what I could find for Persian, that these were appointed men by the upper group, by the princes of the royal family, the senior members of that nobility, and their job was to check the power of these potentially overmighty governors. And so they were kind of the checks and balance type thing of even our current government is supposed to have. One of their primary duties in their staff was to collect the tributes, to go around and collect the taxes that was to be given to the king. And that was often, it's kind of funny, as I was looking at the Persian law, it said this function was often farmed out to tax farmers. Like, IRS, anybody? It's just the tax collector idea. They operated in companies, they operated in organizations, a lot of abuse. The next group would have been governors or deputies. They were representative within the territories. These governors and deputies, their word was law in their little areas. The same way the king's word, they could, as long as they dispensed quote unquote justice, collecting tributes and all of those things, as long as they were making the king happy, they could get by with quite a bit. Seems to be that there was quite a bit of corruption across the land. If you've got this big of an area, all these different governors and princes that you got over all these areas, you're going to, have corruption because, what you don't inspect, you can't expect, and you lose that ability. However, these administrators, those who were doing the king's business, they were permanent garrisons that were stationed throughout the empire at strategic points along the frontier and guarding main routes. These are the infantry. These are the guys that were trying to keep the word of law. And they would make sure that you didn't see these other small armies rising up. That was their job, to make sure there was no organization, not just to the Jews, of anybody, trying to get a group of people together and arming them. So you've got all of these different groups that are laid out for us in verse 3. They're saying that all of these people in all these different positions of authority, that they're assisting, they're doing the king's business. They assisted the Jews. They turned from doing the bidding of the king to assisting the Jews, which was also allowed. And it says, because of the dread of Mordecai had fallen upon him. Another real quick comment on this is, there's an interesting thing to me. We've had Mordecai the Jew, Mordecai the Jew, Mordecai the Jew, all the way through. Look at verse 4 again. Indeed, Mordecai was great in the king's house, and his fame spread throughout all the provinces for the man Mordecai. It's not the Jew Mordecai. It's like he has status. He's not a sub-status character anymore. He is a full Persian, if you will, in the minds of the people in these moments. And the fear of them became greater and greater. They show us that the majority of the Persians refused to go after the Jews. By and large, we can make a couple assumptions. It could be that the professional soldiers or those that were mercenaries, they might have attacked the Jews those who were loyal to Haman, even though he was gone. If they were not mercenaries, they could be people who just hated the Jews for whatever reason. Or they were people who stood to gain something, i.e. their property, their possessions, their servants, their families, whatever. But again, the retribution was limited to the enemies of the Jews, those who hated them, those who attacked them. This was not a vengeance plot. When we start getting into the next section, beginning at verse 5, thus the Jews struck all their enemies with the sword, killing and destroying, and they did what they pleased to those who hated them. At the citadel in Susa, the Jews killed and destroyed 500 men. Let's just put a pause right here. So even with all that's going on against the enemies of the Jews, there were some that were so hateful, so destructive, they're still coming after them. The terms that get used, the sword, the slaying, the destroying, if you look at them, they parallel verse 5, verse 10, verse 16, all kind of say that same idea. And when they did this, they were defeated. The next list we have is the list of the names, and I'm going to come back to them in a minute. In verse 7, 8, 9, the sons of Haman. But drop down to verse 11. On that day, the numbers who were killed at the citadel in Susa was reported to the king. So the first wave is 500. If this had been a vengeance plot, that number would have been much, much higher. So what we're saying at this point, and I might as well throw it out there, there's an absence. And it shows up in the text, and it creates all kinds of questions. When we read all of this, you're going to get 500, you're going to get 300 more, and then you're going to get a number that says 75,000 men. Who were the Jews allowed to kill?
Women and children.
The men, women, and children. Now that description has been previously listed, but when we get to this point, it just says the men. Now, there's a lot of, don't let that go too far in your head, because I want to hear what you think might have been the case with that. So we have 800 men, 500 the first day, 300 on the second day, and 75,000 throughout the rest of the kingdom. There were probably 100 million people in the empire. Numbers vary on the numbers of Jews, anywhere from one, a high, which I'm not sure the source they had for it, was as high as 15. But even if it was 15 million versus 100 million, it's still pretty amazing. The odds are against God's people, but as many people have always commented in kind of a colloquial form, but it's a reality, one with God is always a majority. Because God is a creator, God is all-powerful. And the Lord has brought Esther and Mordecai to this kingdom, and to use Mordecai's words, for such a time as this. This is what they're there for. So there's some important facts. The Jews killed only those who attacked them. It appears they only killed the men at this point. It's going to be mentioned as we get down through here. They don't take the loot, they don't take the plunder, although they had the right to do so. the fact that these numbers are such a wide disparity, people want to say, well, God let him kill 75,000 people. We're talking 75,000 people versus 1 million that could have been obliterated. Or if that number was higher, even more. So if we're not trying to balance scales here, not only that, we're talking about 1 million defenseless people before God set that statute up. So the critics are going to say, it's wrong for the Jews to kill these 75,000 people. These are 75,000 would-be murderers. These are 75,000 would-be capital crime. These, again, would fit under the just war principle that we talked about a couple of weeks ago. And I don't like to put it this way, but would it have been better if the 75,000 Persians had killed 10 times as many Jews? Would that have been better? Would that have been a more equal carrying out of justice? I don't think so. Now, Mordecai's decree was in absolute agreement with God's covenant in Genesis chapter 12. Genesis chapter 12, verses 1 to 3 is what we classically call the Abrahamic covenant. It's not just those 3 verses, but it boils down to this. God tells to Abraham that he's going to make of him a great nation. He's going to send him to a land that he's going to show him, that he's going to give him this offspring. And he says in this covenant, I will bless those that bless you, and I will curse those who curse you, and in you all the nations of the world will be blessed. Mordecai's decree was consistent with God's covenant that he'd made with Israel, with Abraham specifically. Isaac would have also agreed with Mordecai. When Isaac blessed Jacob, he said, cursed be everyone who curses you, and blessed be everyone that blesses you. That's Genesis chapter 27. In Exodus chapter 32, God promised to Moses, I will be an enemy to your enemies and an adversary to your adversaries. And then I jotted in my notes, I think I already mentioned it, but J. Vernon McGee's quote, the Jew has attended the funeral of every one of the nations that's tried to exterminate him. That's been true down through the ages, and it's going to continue. And Mordecai's rise is part of the story's ending. When we get into verse 5, it returns to the corporate victory of the Jews. When you get through verses 1 to 4, it seems like it kind of goes, Jews, Mordecai. Then you get to verse 5, and it kind of goes back out from Mordecai, out to the national focus of what's going on. The actions that are taking place are retaliation, they're self-defense. They are not a do-as-you-like kind of attack. The language used to describe the victory is actually very compact and kind of familiar when it comes to listing off casualties. So this passage comes to this kind of climax of the narrative. The primary theme is the survival of the Jews, and this gives the details of their survival. This is the details of how they survive. These people in a foreign land ultimately could never have survived without the grace of God. They wouldn't have survived. It's not possible. And again, God's name is not mentioned specifically. The deliverance of his people, I think, is enough of a biblical arc theme that you can take it right into this passage and see God's hand. And we've commented that many times. The phrase that is in there at the end of verse 5, they did what they pleased to those who hated them. It's the English translations of that, in every translation, seems to carry it pretty close to that. And it makes it seem like, well, they just did whatever they wanted to do at this point. But the language is actually parallel to the language of chapter 3 and verse 11. It's parallel to Haman's decree to do whatever you want with them. So the language is parallel, but that's not like an authorization to do whatever you want. You are allowed to kill those that are attacking you. That doesn't mean you can go in and rape and kill and murder and steal and just do whatever you want during this quote-unquote time of plunder. The law that was enacted in chapter 8 was very, very narrow, but again, it did include women and children. So let's talk about that for a second. Why do you think that women and children are absent from the death tolls? Mara?
Well, I wouldn't think women and children would be going after them. It's just usually the men.
Okay.
So when it said even the women and children that come after, but I don't think the women and children went after them.
Okay. Maybe the women and children didn't go after them.
Doesn't this all go back to the Agagite and the failure to eliminate that, where they were
Yep.
failure to do all that? And now, even as it goes on, with 10 sons
Of Haman.
Haman, my mind,
It's all right, I got you.
they're going to be dealt with. And it says their seed.
Their Agagite line is going to be wiped out. That part is true.
So, I mean, that would be why the decree would have included this, women and children.
The decree would have did very much include it. One assumption is the possibility that women and children were killed, because often in Scripture you will find instances and stories where there's just the number of the men. Think in your mind, an easy example is the feeding of the 5,000. There were 5,000 men and women and children. You know, there's numbers like that that are included. It feels good to say, well, the Jews just didn't kill the women and children. It feels good to think that way. Theologically, I don't think, again, under the just war principle, there would have been a problem had they done so. But I find it interesting that we've been hearing women and children, women and children, women and children, then we get to this chapter and women and children are missing.
Are you using the NASB?
This is NAS.
Does that say 75,000 men?
I got 3 translations going, so let me.
The NIV says they're enemies, and they killed 75,000 of them in verse 16.
Yeah, I'm.
King James says slew of their foes.
Yeah, 75 of those who hated them is what the King James says.
I'm just saying it doesn't use the word men.
Yeah, it's.
In connection with 75,000.
Yeah, it's an interesting description of how these numbers all lay out. And this, I wanted to bring this up for a specific reason. This is sometimes what happens when we have an emotional issue that crashes up against a theological issue. Sometimes we want to superimpose on the text something that makes us feel better that the text doesn't say. And don't get me wrong, I don't know. I wasn't there. It's not specific for me, so I don't know. It's not specific enough one way or another. But it's interesting how many commentators took this absence of the mentions of women and children and tried to make it a Jews had mercy and grace on all the women and children. They may have, but that's superimposing an emotional need onto the text. It's not what the text says. We've always got to be careful of those things. I'm not saying that they didn't spare the women and children. I don't know. But let's be careful when we're reading things like this and we read something in the text that rubs us the wrong way. For example, a few weeks ago when we talked about the fact, why would God tell them they can kill the women and children? That seems not. It rubs us the wrong way. It hits us in a place that we're uncomfortable with it. And just because there's not a record of the women and children that are mentioned, you know, doesn't mean it didn't happen, but it doesn't mean that it did happen. So let me go back a little bit to the kids in verses 7 to 9, talking about the sons of Haman. You say, why do you want to do this? Because the Jews do something with these verses to this day. When the Feast of Purim happens, one of the challenges of whoever's reading the story has to pronounce and say all of their names in one breath. They have to take a deep breath and they have to say them all in one breath. That's what they do. It's kind of a tradition, not a biblical thing. It's just how they do it. Parshandatha, the first one, it's the it's an interesting word. It was means given by prayer. It means a person from the law, a person from the Torah. And the Jewish commentator said that Haman would have named his son that way to validate the Agathites by using that name. So you see these Parshan Bathal kind of, these pronunciations are horrible for me. Dalphone, it means, it's a door. It's a person who is doing a good thing with bad intentions. It's doing the right thing, but really to try to get something negative out of it. When we get to Ashpathah, this is the third son in the group. It means gathering. It's a person who desires to hoard items such as money or possessions or people, so much so that they don't have time for the Torah. When we move to Porathal, these are all so hard. I'm slaughtering, I can promise. If you use them, if you spell that word backwards, it's a word used in the Talmud to indicate a woman's private parts. So the word, when it's flipped around, is turned to a lust word, meaning that a person that desired to look on an uncovered woman. Now you see what kind of boys Haman's got here, okay? We're talking about cream of the crop, top names here. Hadaliah is fifth son. It translates to feelings of arrogance or haughtiness. Aridapha is to a person that, like a lion, preys and waits for a distraction. Parmashatha is to rip apart. It had the idea of ripping a garment or ripping a person or an animal apart. Arishai, it means to poison with venom, like the venom of a snake. Like I said, these are just, whoo! These are what I name my kids every time, you know? And remember, names had meanings back then. And all of these names, as you hear them, I want you to understand, Haman has named all of them with words of power and strength, words of conquering, words of, he's got ideas in his brain for all these 10 kids he's got. Aridai, it is one that causes suffering or worry. I can't even try this. Vayazapha. See, this is, even in Hebrew, to do it all in one breath would be a task. It means bitterness. And so I'm just looking at all this, and you read all these names, and in English, we just go, oh, this list of names I can't pronounce. Let's just skip those verses. This is what I'm going to put this in scripture meeting, let Jonathan read them on Sunday morning or something. Specifically pick. Mike, you can do that next week, okay?
Sure. Why not?
We'll put up all these, and we look at it, and even from like the Feast of Purim, it's almost like I tell you that they have to say them all in one breath. They've turned it into a joke in current culture over the time period. But every one of these kids was named. You could purport that Haman named them with the idea of raising them up to overthrow. Whether that means other Persians or it meant to overthrow the Jews specifically, we don't know. But he was trying to raise up, his own army. He's not necessarily trying to raise up good-statured gentlemen to be, take over after him. He's looking for people to cause death and difficulty. At the end of verse 10, and we'll quit with this, it says, then the 10 sons of Haman, the son of Hammedatha, the Jews' enemy, but they did not lay their hands on the plunder. Now again, according to law of this time period, when you conquered the individual, you owned their property. You owned whatever they owned. It was totally legal. If you killed somebody in a just killing, everything that was in their house was yours. But the Jews did not do so. It's very reminiscent of a couple other stories in Scripture where they were actually challenged not to take stuff, and some people brought stuff back into camp anyway and caused all kind of trouble. But you again see in some way God doing something through this people group, these Jews at this point, that they did what they had to do, but they didn't go any further, so to speak, if I could say it that way. They defended their homes, they defended themselves, but they didn't go further than that. Didn't even take advantage of the law of the land, if you will, to take their possessions. Now this does a couple things. One is it sets them up pretty good for the future. Because if this is what you saw them do, and you're a Persian, you're going to go, hey, these guys could have done much worse, and they didn't. I mean, look, they left all that stuff behind. They didn't take their stuff. I mean, you could have had some positive feelings come out of the fact that, okay, yeah, they killed my next door neighbor, but if my next door neighbor hadn't come after him with a sword, it wouldn't have happened. And they didn't do anything else. They didn't go the step further. And so it is, I think it shows the actions, the motivations of the Jewish people is consistent with the spirit that the law that that Mordecai wrote. The spirit of that was carried out consistent. Really, this instance corrects Saul's error. Where Saul was supposed to wipe out this group of people, now it's happening. It's being taken place. That is one of the arguments that is used, that women and children were involved in at least those 10 people, because it seems that this indication of the reversal. If the sons of Haman had children, the people group still exists. So if they indeed had that seed, now maybe they didn't kill the women, maybe they just killed the sons. We could talk about all that too. Jack?
Yeah, but that theory is going by the assumption that Haman was the only surviving Amalekite, and by this time, from Saul to him, that line, there could have been a lot more Amalekites, not just Haman's family.
One would think.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean,
You know what the problem with it? I agree with you. The problem is we have no record of them. And that's an intriguing thought. You know, there's no record. So where were they? But I agree with you. It seems to me we've had a lot of time since Saul let them live. I mean, you know, it was, you know, Hamadatha, was he kind of slow to the draw here and only had one kid? I mean, that wasn't normal in this culture. I mean, that wasn't the norm at all. It was, you know, get your quiver as full as possible was kind of the idea, especially if you wanted to propagate a people and carry off a people group. So I guess as we kind of, we go back to this, so you see that Saul was supposed to kill, this time the Jews do kill. Saul took all the plunder of the Amalekites. He was forbidden to do so then. They were permitted to do so, at least under law, but they did not do so in here. Again, further leading to the idea that there's kind of a full reversal of what Saul's failure was now the Jews' victory. At the end of the day, I guess it almost goes without being said, but let's say it. If Saul had done what he was supposed to do, the book of Esther would be unnecessary. I mean, I know that sounds kind of, but then we talk about the providential hand of God and the free will of mankind and how that all works out. God still works out his purposes even when man executes foolishness. It may be delayed, but just because God is delaying something doesn't mean that God's not going to follow through. One of the arguments that's going to come about in 2 Peter, one of the fallacies, the false teachings that comes out is because Jesus has not returned at that point, that it was all a lie. That's the idea. Well, it's not happened yet, so it's not going to happen. You know, you could label anything of God's promises and say, well, they've not happened yet, so they must not be true. And that's just not the way God operates. I mean, I don't know if y'all know this or not, but God doesn't have a wristwatch. Mara.
I want to go back to the women and children.
Yeah, of course.
No, because, now think about it, you got this decree, that they're allowed to kill anybody that attacks them, including women and children. Now, you're the guy who wants to attack them. Are you gonna say then, come on, wife and child, come with me? No, you're gonna tell them, they'll kill you if you come with me. That was my thought, that's why they didn't go with them.
I do understand that possibility, Jonathan.
One of the things I'm thinking of is the fact that maybe the reason why they didn't take the plunder is that Mordecai ended up taking over Haman's possessions. And they knew that, he was
He was in a place to make sure they fared well. Let's just play it that way. Mordecai could have placed them in some very good positions down the line. Of course, this time period doesn't last very good for the Jews, but
And they left the plunder for the women and children.
Mara's worried about them, then she's worried about all them little babies and them women. Kenny.
I just say that through it all, it just shows the integrity of the Jewish people and what's going on. And they're not gonna be seen in that light as kings.
Well, let's just say that until this point, the Jews have lost their testimony. By their choices, by being put into captivity, by what they've gone through, they've lost their influence in culture. And I think this is a way to restore that, to show that there is a legitimate, we talked about the fact that, they called for this nationwide fast back with Mordecai and Esther and everything. And that was like a new kind of revival kind of moment. And sometimes when you have those revival moments, the question is, well, did they just have an emotional experience or did they really have a revival moment? Well, if you take this over the span of time and you look at how they're handling this, it seems to be that there's something more going on than just that moment that was back there. It's affecting them even to the point where they were in places of peril.
Question though, and
Yeah.
all through this captivity here that we're talking about this one, and you say they've lost their mourning, they lost their nationality essentially, but
Right.
there was not the synagogues, the teaching, and all that going on, so it's hard to understand how they would recognize the faults of Saul and what he did. So how did they respond in the manner they did without these teachings?
One of the great questions that it seems that in Mordecai's language, he had an understanding of previous Old Testament. We see that he seems to have had some at least basic understanding. The Jews have been assimilated at this point, and they've basically morphed into the captive people around them. Didn't mean that there wouldn't have been access to those, I don't know what the right word would be, religious leaders. I mean, the priest system is gone. The system of that would most naturally have taught, that's gone. But they would have still had access to, especially to tradition. Could it be simply something where God has called to their minds what they have heard in past generations? Could they have read something? We have very, very little understanding of exactly what kind of written texts we have of the Torah into this point. We have some assumptions, but I can't sit here and say, well, they had Genesis, Leviticus, and Numbers in the scrolls, and they took them with them into Assyria, into Persia. We don't have that record.
That would be an example of how God's preeminence is leading, is moving people, and that's what's happening with Israel at this time.
Right.
In this captivity.
Very much. And as we finish off the chapter and everything next time, you'll see how what has happened became an issue, well, not to give the spoiler, as if we don't most know, but there's going to be another audience with the queen, and the king. There's going to be one further step, you know, of how this all gets carried out. But then, well, here's the spoiler. This is the first feast or first celebration that was not instituted by God himself. The people instituted the Feast of Purim. Usually it was God set a feast. God set a holiday. The people here set the holiday. What kind of implications does that have when you are the freed people who are setting up a holiday or a feast for God's benefit?
And that's gone on till
Still operated today. Feast of Purim still happens. It's in March and April every year. And they read the whole book of Esther, and they dress up in costumes. And the description that you're going to read, and we get into the rest of this chapter, it's pretty much it's a party. It's a huge, just big old fun party. Now, not all the feasts are that way. I mean, Sukkot, they go out and, you know, supposed to live in these tents for a few days, and there's an idea of sacrifice and celebration. The Feast of Purim is all about celebration. All about celebration. So we'll try to cap this off the next time. I know everybody wants to know what we're going to do after this. I'll tell you where I'm leaning, and I will probably put out a Facebook poll just to see what you think. I'm leaning towards doing at least the first 6 to 9 chapters of Genesis is what I'm leaning towards. So that's where I'm kind of leaning towards right now. But I got a couple of other ideas. But let me pray for you. Again, don't miss this. Just because we may not be winning these battles, even that we're facing, even on Tuesday with elections and things like that, and we see unrighteous, unholy people seemingly celebrate. I mean, God gives us mercy every once in a while. Our current speaker, I think, is one of those mercy moments that God has given to us. But just because it looks like God's not winning doesn't mean that God has not already won. And that's the emphasis in the book of Esther. And it's not just true of a nation, it's true of the individual. Just because you might be going through something personally, some financial, some physical challenge, some health challenge, some other challenge, that supposed defeat does not mean that that's all that God has in mind for you. Just because you can't see it doesn't mean that God's not already got the lights on, the fire lit, and all the comfy clothes ready for you to celebrate in his presence. God, thank you so much for, again, the truths of Esther. So many deep things that are going on here that are so hard for us in some ways to wrap our brains around because we don't live this way. This is not the culture that we live in. And even reading history or watching it on a movie or video of some sort, we do our best to wrap our brain around it. But at the end of the day, one of the things that I just keep reminding myself, and you keep drawing to my mind, is even when your name is absence, you're still at work. You're right there in the midst of it. Even when I feel like I just can't see your hand in a certain area, it's still there. We can trust you. We can trust you until the point when our faith becomes sight. We know that's a promise that will happen. We will experience that sight. But until then, may we be people of faith in who you are, in your character. And may that transform how we live and how we look at our circumstances. We pray in Christ's name. Amen.